Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. I was quite sick the last day or two, but I've bounced back and I'm relying on my constitution, which hasn't failed me yet, and my passion for the topic to carry me through, also without a co-host today. Probably could have had one, but just too out of it to get that arranged. So anyway, continuing with the mutual aid series, quite excited. Support for the show. Thank you so much. It is really helping. Support for the show is gratefully received a subscribe star. Link is in the YouTube video description. And getting distracted by Clossington's comment. I will school you, Clossington. You will see. Okay, anyway, support for the show is gratefully received. Most people just give $5 a month, but few people do that, more than a few, and it adds up to really covering the cost of the show and everything. So thanks very much for that. Why do I feel like I need to check my audio levels? Audio levels should be fine, right? Actually, let me just check one other thing. Make sure that my on this mic. Yep, that looks good. And to cover 2 chapters, coming out of sickness and covering 2 chapters. Here we go. So far we've mostly covered what I think of as the fun part, right? How mutual aid worked, how it functioned at its height. But obviously the name of the book, this is a book by David Beto called From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State. So we're going to go from talking about how mutual aid worked to how various things came to threaten and undermine the mutual aid system that had become very strong by the late 1800s, early 20th century. So we're getting into the part of the story that's a little more grim, but I like how this works today. I'm glad I decided to cover 2 chapters, because the first chapter they kind of lose and the second chapter they kind of win, to give you a bit of a foreshadowing. Okay, so what happens first here in chapter 7, it almost bled the system white, is that there is a battle to start having legislation about mutual aid societies. Okay. And he starts by reminding us he starts by reminding us that politics was one of the dirty words of fraternalism, and the writings and rituals of the societies repeatedly celebrated the lodge's splendid isolation from the cares and controversies of the outside world, including those involving governmental policies. But things started to change. By the late 19th century, fraternalists found that political questions could not be ignored. As early as the 1870s, legislators began to consider laws to regulate life insurance societies, which would include mutual aid societies that provided life insurance. Some mutual aid societies, particularly like in Britain, were more focused on funeral benefits and didn't get into life insurance, right? But in the United States, fraternal societies more often offered life insurance. And because old liners often supported these proposed legislative restrictions, fraternalists charged with much accuracy that the motivation was to quash bothersome competitors. That is, an older mutual aid society that was well established might support this legislation because that would prevent a new society from getting started. This is a very typical tactic. Anyone who knows the public choice literature on regulatory capture will know that this is a very typical pattern. Um, the industry itself asks to be regulated. Why would they do that? Because the typical thing we're taught in school is that, like, the wicked, greedy corporations don't want to be regulated by the government. They just want to be able to do whatever they want. Well, no, what actually happens is the wicked, greedy corporations that are well established send lobbyists to Washington or to their state government and try to get laws established to prevent competition from newer upstart competitors. And generally, part of the reason we're in the mess we're in is because they've been very successful by now in a lot of different sectors of society. But anyway, that's getting ahead of ourselves. So there was a formation of something called the NFC in 1885. The NFC was the National Fraternal Congress. And this was meant to defend against these attempts to put regulation or legislation regulation on the fraternal orders. So in 1890, the Committee on Legislation of the NFC recommended that no law, quote, subjecting the fraternal orders to state control in any way should be permitted to be enacted. So we'll call this the laissez-faire position, right? Leave the fraternal orders alone. Just let them, compete out there in the market, so to speak, in the voluntary order, and stand and fall on their own. Right. In the Fraternal Monitor, a publication of some fraternal societies, a writer charged that legislation like this invariably paved the way for unintended and highly destructive consequences. If the people get in the dangerous habit of thinking that their lawgivers can protect them from frauds, they will lean upon a broken stick every time. I actually think that's an excellent argument for what it's worth as a political economist. What happens, and we could bring up something that happened in the last several years as an example. I don't know if I can bring it up by name without getting in trouble with YouTube, but you establish some government entity that's going to regulate the safety of something or whatever. And once they sign it off as safe, everybody's like, well, it's safe. We can trust them, right? This is the leaning on a broken stick, right? Well, government entities being what they are, they make mistakes, right? And they tell everybody something's safe, and then later you figure out that it wasn't so safe. Caveat lector, I think that's right. Caveat lector, let the buyer beware. This is the watchword in a voluntary society. You can't just say, hey, government, keep me safe in everything and be safe. It's not that simple, right? And yet, the NFC recommended a uniform law in 1892 for enactment by the states. And this would define the parameters of a fraternal society. Each association shall have a lodge system with ritualistic form of work and representative form of government, and shall make provision for the payment of benefits in case of sickness, disability, or death of its members, subject to their compliance with its constitution and laws. It encouraged disclosure, which they came to call publicity, disclosure through annual reports, meaning be transparent with the the financials of the order. Okay, so there thus began a political debate about the uniform law, which gets another hostile nickname for it, which we'll learn in a moment. But he says to really understand this, you have to understand how they had set up death benefits, how they'd been working for a while, but I guess it wasn't actuarially sound in essence, the structure that they had originally. By the way, everything I'm reading here, it's with an eye towards doing this again and learning from previous mistakes, right? So be actuarially sound is lesson number one today. Anyway, So during the late 19th century, most societies relied on post-mortem assessments. Members paid the same premium regardless of age. And in the simplest version, to understand how this worked, societies required an equal per capita assessment, usually $1, upon the death of a member. So if someone dies, everyone owes $1 when that person dies, right? So they're not building up a reserve or anything like that. It's just as needed, people pay. And so some promised a death benefit of $1,000, others offer as much as $2,000. Bear in mind, this is well over 100 years ago, so this is real money. There, I didn't do the inflation-adjusted figure, but it's good money. And the postmortem approach continued to predominate until the 1890s. It was simple, everybody understood it. And on the surface, the early experience with this system, this assessment system, was a stunning success. In 1896, the median annual assessment paid by members of the 29 leading fraternal orders was just over $10 per $1,000 of insurance, whereas an old line policy of the same value was about $20 for a man at age 25 and $48 at age 50. So the fraternal societies, in other words, were beating insurance companies on cost. It was actually cheaper to go with a fraternal society for insurance. But then they hit, as usual, when you're not actuarially sound, they hit the problem of an aging membership, more people dying, and that dollar, you're getting hit for $1 more frequently, right? So between 1887 and 1895, the average annual death rate for 25 large life insurance orders rose from 7 per year to 10 per year. I'm sorry, the death rate. So 7% to 10%, I guess. In several extreme cases, it more than doubled. Increased death rates resulted in higher and more frequent assessment calls, right? Give us that dollar, give us that dollar. Unable to carry the added weight of mounting assessments, younger members dropped out by the thousands and turned to companies or newer, cheaper rate societies. As a result, the older organizations faced the bleak prospect of an elderly and dwindling membership base. So they were not set up in a way so that the deal was good for newer, younger people, right? I guess a little bit of that pyramid scheme problem, right? They hadn't structured it quite right. And the assessment system, at least for life insurance, stood and fell on the willingness of the old and the young to stay loyal, even when that meant higher rates over time. Like, is there some other reason to stay in this, even though it's seeming less and less of a good deal, as with more people dying, more benefits needing to be paid out. So how did they keep it going? They did keep it going quite a while. They accomplished this because of extra revenue generated from profits on assets, such as rentals from meeting halls. And in addition, because of visiting committees, which we discussed in detail before, they were able to police malingering and maintain solidarity. So during the early days of these life insurance orders, their leaders, usually with complete sincerity, had held out the promise that a low assessment for all ages could always continue. But when these promises proved unfounded, many members reacted with hostility and skepticism, right? So someone was not doing the numbers and thinking ahead of how this was going to play out. And so the leaders had the unenviable task of explaining to members why their earlier promises of cheap rates for both old and young had been wrong. So there's different ways they could have gone, right? If you know anything about life insurance, there's whole life and there's term life. Term life is a policy that expires after so many decades or whatever. But few societies were actually willing to abandon their reliance on whole life policies, at least for new members. The marketing appeal was too strong to resist. So that path out of it didn't really work. Efforts to retain members probably worked best when deeper loyalties such as religious belief, ethnicity, or ideology held together the rank and files. Such ties were strongest in small, neighborhood-oriented societies that depended on local knowledge and mutual trust, right? So the smaller societies had an advantage there because tighter bonds of whatever sort, right? Ethnic or whatever. In 1904, Walter Nichols marveled that associations which, measured by ordinary mercantile standards, would be pronounced hopelessly insolvent had been carried along for years through the loyal support of their members. So I think we have to be cautious in learning from that, right? Yes, I think part of the whole point of this series about mutual aid is that working on more intimate knowledge of people because you have more in common with each other, right? We talked about the importance of exclusion for making this all work. That is to say, keeping yourself to a tight group that you are strongly connected with in some form or fashion. That's all very important, but part of what I'm drawing from this is that only lasts so long. I mean, if you're just you're just charging people more. Membership fees are going up and up and up, and it's just not. It's a worse and worse deal. I mean, eventually, it's just a bad deal, no matter how great your loyalty to each other is. So it seems to me there needs to be some kind of balance between being actuarially sound and then having that those bonds and accountability with each other to deal with malingering and to have the benefits of loyalty and knowledge of each other, minimizing risk. Yes, thank you. So let's see. Yeah, so even under the best conditions, like all the local loyalties, whatever, the assessment method included a bothersome element of instability, right? Because the number of assessment calls could vary wildly, depending on how many people died that year. And sometimes lots of people were dying because something was going on, right? So they could reach almost unbearable levels during unanticipated crises, such as the yellow fever outbreak of the late 1870s. So most organizations founded during the late 19th century, that is, they're already learning lessons from how the mistakes made by earlier groups. They instituted graded rather than equal assessments. That means the size of premiums varied with entry, but remained level throughout the life of the member. So, for example, under the plan of the foresters, the lifetime annual for new members gradually increased from 40 cents per month at age 18 to 60 cents at age 40, and finally to $1.85 at age 54. So you join it, and it's understood that as you get older and you're better established in your career, we're going to assess a little more on you. So, a little bit of a transfer from the older, well-established people to the younger, right? And I suppose also from the people who are closer to death, statistically, to the people who are less close to death. So it made a certain kind of sense. And so that started to be widely adopted. But that was not enough to get actuarial solvency. They were current fraternal rates, even with graded assessments, were still too low to accumulate an adequate reserve. So fraternal leaders gradually became convinced that unless they took drastic action, there would be no revenue to pay future benefits as they came due. And so they started just increasing premiums, right? Sorry, guys, membership rates need to go up to handle all this. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit here of what they called readjustment, meaning changing the rates people had signed up for, right? Now, this is interesting. Bear in mind that we're focusing on the US in this book, but a lot of these orders were the American branch of an originally British, British or Australian society. So a lot of these problems had already been faced before this in these other countries. Americans could have avoided much of the ordeal of readjustment had they heeded the experience of the friendly societies in Great Britain and Australia. As Bouchier puts it, history repeats itself. The conditions of the English societies described in 1850 were almost identical to the conditions of our societies of 1900. That is, the English societies were hitting this problem in 1850, and it wasn't until the late 19th century or almost 1900 that the American societies are starting to realize, okay, we got to restructure things. The last wave of British readjustment, since they hit the problems in 1850, the last wave came in the 1880s, and the process took nearly 50 years for them to, readjust and get on a sound basis. So the American fraternal advocates of readjustment embraced the British model as their own, and one of the lessons was that the same underlying principles govern in the business operations of fraternal societies and fraternal orders, including the eternal laws of mortality. So, some of these problems are not new, right? We can literally just learn from people who did this before. No reason to go through the pain as if no one has done this before. Okay, so fraternalism versus paternalism. So by the first decade of the 20th century now, few fraternal leaders openly questioned the desirability of adequate rates. Instead, the topic of debate shifted to what role, if any, government would play in achieving this goal. So you have like the laissez-faire side, who wanted a regulatory hands-off policy on rates and reserves. And then on the other side, you had people calling for greater regulation through state law or insurance commissions. And these were slowly gaining, the pro-regulation side was slowly gaining an influence, right? So, so when the NFC recommended that the states enact a new uniform law, critics called it the force bill. And Beto says the name fit. The older societies had expressly tailored the law to their needs. They inserted a provision, for example, denying approval to societies charging less than the rates given in the NFC table. This is very common, by the way, from studying political economy. Minimum wage laws, as Thomas Sowell's written about, were pioneered particularly in New York City, as I recall, because they wanted to, they didn't want Black Southerners who were migrating to New York City to undercut the white workers by charging cheaper rates. Whatever you think of that, recognize the pattern here, which is that in labor, for example, one way that you compete is you're like, well, I have less skills than the established people, but I'll work for cheaper, right? But then I'll gain skills and then I'll be able to charge more. Well, you can sort of cut the bottom rungs off the ladder, so to speak, legally, and prevent people from charging those cheaper rates and gaining the experience and getting to the point where they're real competition by just not letting them, just making it illegal for them to work for cheaper. So it's a similar idea here, right? We just won't let some upstart fraternal order come in with a cheaper rate. We'll just force them. They've got to charge as much as we charge, right? And then the upstart now, can't compete on price, and they're not well established and well known, so they just end up not starting at all. Would be the idea. So it's anti-competitive, right? Supporters of the force bill justified it as necessary to give breathing space for readjustment by preventing unfair competition from the cheap rate societies. In other words, we need to raise our rates, but we're afraid if we raise our rates, then people will go to some other society that isn't raising their rates or isn't actuarially sound, perhaps. So we'll fix it by just making everybody charge some minimal rate, right? So the force bill met with determined fraternal opposition. Newer societies aligned against it. And so about 40 of them organized a new organization, the Associated Fraternities of America, AFA, as a rival to the NFC. And so the first president of the AFA described the force bill as a paternalistic ploy by the fraternal old guard to quash rivals. He compared the leaders of the NFC to the Pharisees and hypocrites of the scriptures. I feel like I should fall into a preacher cadence, The Pharisees and hypocrites of the scriptures, who, while eager to bind burdens grievous to be borne and place them upon the shoulders of others, do not propose to touch the burdens with one of its fingers. As several advocates of stricter legislation later noted, the harsh double standard of the force bill was difficult to ignore. Something all the opponents of the force bill had in common: they linked their case to a general critique of expansive and meddling government. And this brings us to one of the political themes in around this period, the late 19th and early 20th century, as we'll see. In 1900, for example, the Fraternal Monitor editorialized that the government is best which governs least. 6 years later, it warned that the state, as represented by state officials, should not undertake to think for the individual. Societies should be left to work out their destinies according to the light and experience they have, and they warned that interests having nothing in common with the fraternal system should be required to keep hands off so long as the readjustment is progressing satisfactorily. And then this fellow, who is this? Oh yeah, this is Landis, and the editors of the Fraternal Monitor. So Landis was quite laissez-faire at this period. You'll see later he shifts. But anyway, in rhetoric reminiscent of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Landis characterized the force bill as part of an effort by the bureaucratic forces of the state to stifle the creative forces of society, state and society, capital S in both these cases. By society, he meant organizations for mutual assistance, such as fraternal orders. Landis exhorted Americans to be more jealous of their sovereignty and to check the present tendency toward imperialism, so plainly evidenced in the prevailing disposition of office holders to assume the attitude of rulers over subjects. And the author just points out that they weren't very consistent. Many laissez-faire fraternalists had supported legislation and court rulings against societies that paid endowments or child insurance. So, it's sort of free markets for me, but not for thee sometimes. But anyway, the people are consistent. The defenders of the hands-off approach, like the advocates of readjustment, favored the British model. They pointed out that the friendly societies had readjusted with a minimum of governmental interference. And then it goes into some details about the Act of 1896 in the UK. For critics of the force bill, the British system represented a desirable model of bureaucratic restraint and simplicity. The British Act, the 1896 Act, left the friendly societies otherwise free to exercise self-government and implement corrective measures on their own terms. The campaign against the force bill was largely successful initially. So, around 1900, say. But by 1908, the leaders of the AFA, the one that had started to resist this, increasingly accepted the view that restrictive legislation would come. The terms of debate no longer centered on the desirability of increased regulation on rates and reserves, but on the details. So what happened? What happened with this shift from, hey, just keep your hands off, to, okay, there's going to be restrictive legislation. Let's just try to make it less bad, So Beto says the best explanation for the change of heart was the growing influence of new power alignments. The course of events increasingly demonstrated that if the fraternalists did not control the law writing process, others who were antagonistic to their interests would. So they took this on as like a defensive strategy. And you often see this. I don't know if the story's been well told anywhere, but I remember watching it play out in real time, that Apple under Steve Jobs had been very resistant to getting involved with politics. I guess it had one person in Washington or something, but it effectively had no lobbying presence. Steve Jobs was not like hanging out with presidents and all this stuff. Tim Cook, as you may know, has met with every president multiple times. I think Steve Jobs' attitude was, hey, we're making products. Why do I want to get involved with politics? And then basically they were given an offer they couldn't refuse, like get involved with politics or politics will get involved with you. And suddenly Apple ramped up its spending on lobbying and all that stuff, right? So this happens quite a bit. It doesn't mean that the company, or in this case, the fraternal organizations, are loving the idea, but basically they see it coming and they feel like, well, we better get our voice in there or we're just going to get steamrolled, and they're going to put some kind of law in there that's going to really crush us. At least we can moderate it, right? So this happens quite often. So a handful of schemes were put forward to the federal government to regulate fraternal societies. One was put forward in 1904 by Senator John Dryden, better known as the founder and president of the Prudential Insurance Company. The bill would have barred from the mails all printed matter of fraternal life insurance orders. And his justification is that he equated the fraternal societies with lotteries and fraudulent enterprises. The bill was never taken seriously, but fraternalists took it as a warning shot across the bow, right? They're like, okay, and more is coming. This one didn't go anywhere, but this isn't going to stop. And then let's see, the Voris model law was put forward by the National Convention of Insurance Commissioners in 1902. And the pressure continued to build. Speaking to the Convention of the Commissioners in 1909, James Young, he vowed that if fraternal societies did not take the legislative initiative, it would become the imperative duty of the members of this body to take hold of and do their best to perform the task. So regulate yourself or we'll make sure it happens and we'll do it. And of course, insurance companies were viewed fraternal societies as competitors, or they were competitors. And so we come to the Mobile Law, M-O-B-I-L-E. Why is it called that? I'm not sure why it was called that. The Mobile Law formalized the existing case and statutory law around fraternal societies. It defined a fraternal society as a nonprofit organization with a lodge system, representative government, ritual, and tax exemption. The Mobile Law was a big step away from the old ideas of freedom and publicity. I didn't go over that part, but freedom and publicity was the original thing they put forward. Sure, legislate us so that we have to be open with our books. We agree with you. We should be open with our books. Make it clear what's happening with the money and all that. Members should know what's going on, but otherwise leave us alone. That's what freedom and publicity meant, right? But this Mobile Law was a big step away from that. Its restrictions hindered organizational operation and served to limit fraternal behavior to a narrower realm. With minor exceptions, the Mobile Law barred rates that were any lower than those in the NFC table, an anti-competitive move again, right? Opponents of the law marshaled their forces into an organization called the Federated Fraternities and embraced the old rallying cry of freedom and publicity. Another opponent, Carl Kempton, feared that this law would bring the death of societies by eliminating a defining feature of fraternalism, self-government. That is, the members decide how to run the organization, not some outside body, right? Not some outside regulatory agency or whatever. Assessment insurance, he noted, had successfully provided years of low-cost insurance protection for millions of lower-income Americans, which was true. But the power alignments had changed greatly since the ill-fated Force Bill. Most importantly, the economic constituency for a hands-off policy on rates and reserves, which had once been formidable, had dwindled. By 1910, more restrictive legislation seemed inevitable. And there was also an ideological reason. Fraternalists had lost much of their suspicion of interventionist legislation during the progressive era. So, quick history lesson. Maybe everybody listening knows this, but when I talk about progressives, I tend to be referring to the progressives of this period of over 100 years ago. Their era is, I don't know, late 19th, early 20th century. So plus or minus a few decades around 1900. And they have this focus on it's kind of very similar. The American progressives, I think, have a lot of similarities to the Fabian Society in the UK. I think that is, they're not free market people. They are fans of rule by experts. They want people to be they want things to be more regulated in the sense of being made regular and standard and uniform. They see the sort of patchwork quilt of different kinds of societies, which are different depending on ethnicity and what your trade is. And to them, that just looks very chaotic. It should be standardized. It should be run by experts. It shouldn't be all these amateurs doing things. That's my sense of the spirit of the progressive era. So this is really interesting. In a speech at the National Convention of Insurance Commissioners, D.P. Markey of the Knights of the Maccabees noted that some still thought there should be no standard whatever, but that valuation and publicity should govern wholly here as in England, that each should have whatever rates it pleases, use whatever standard it pleases. But he rejected this position, stating, quote, wow, this quote, "This is not the feeling in America generally. We have become educated along the line of legislation." We believe in legislation now. So the backers of the mobile law soon routed their opponents, and victory came in 1912 when the federated fraternities capitulated by endorsing the proposal, now rechristened the New York Conference Law, after getting a few minor amendments. In 1913, the NFC and the AFA merged to form the National Fraternal Congress of America, the NFCA. This organization soon had no rivals, and by 1919, its campaign for the ideals of the New York Conference Law, widely dubbed the Fraternal Law of the Land, had achieved victory in 40 states. So most of the Union. I don't know how many states there were at that time, but that would be most of them, for sure. So this was the process of readjustment, which ultimately resulted in some legislation regulating fraternal societies, which had been largely unregulated outside of case law, but didn't have legislative restrictions on how they did things. Societies had to contend during this time not only with the normal costs of raising premiums, but also there were disruptions during this period. World War I and the influenza epidemic in 1918-1919, which brought about a lot of people dying, right? As a whole, the membership in life insurance orders continued to increase. The number of fraternal certificates nearly doubled from 4.7 million in 1904 to 8.5 million in 1920. But in relative terms, the societies were losing ground. Fraternal policies represented 49.3% of the value of all life insurance in force in 1908. But by 1928, the percentage had fallen to only 9.1. So, 49.3%, that means a lot of people had fraternal life insurance through a fraternal order. So this was it's just trying to continue to remind everyone, this is a very normal part of life at this time. Not that everyone had it, but you knew someone who had it, right? So by the 1920s, the question was, would there be a future for fraternal orders? And if so, what form would it take? All right, I'm going to send one message to my wife, and then let's hit chapter 8. It substitutes paternalism for fraternalism. Okay. Get a drink as well. All right, so happier chapter here, in my view, because now we're going to talk about another battle that the fraternalists went into. they ultimately embrace the progressive. In the previous chapter, they ultimately embrace the progressive mindset of, or were defeated by it, however you want to say it, that they would have to be regulated in how they were structured, their fees were structured, and so forth. But the endorsement of that New York Conference law by the NFCA did not signal a complete change of heart about the role of government. The leading fraternal publications, such as the Fraternal Monitor and the Western Review, provide ample evidence of a continuing aversion to intrusive bureaucracy and paternalism. This hostility greatly intensified when the NFCA and other fraternal organizations launched a vigorous and ultimately successful campaign against proposals for compulsory health insurance. So people, I did not know this, and probably few remember this, that the move towards compulsory health insurance, which was widely adopted in Europe, that same movement came to America and was defeated in part by fraternal societies. And this chapter tells the story. I find it kind of thrilling personally. We'll see what you think. Okay, so one organization we need to keep in mind is something called the American Association for Labor Legislation, the AALL. They began to lay the groundwork for compulsory insurance in 1912. And the AALL included progressive luminaries such as John R. Commons, Irving Fisher, Richard T. Ely, Irving Fisher, a big Chicago School economist, or proto-Chicago School, something like that. And Richard T. Ely, I know the name so well. I'm not sure if he was an economist, but anyway, someone in the social sciences, I believe. And his campaign slogan, touting compulsory health insurance as the next great step in social legislation, did not seem out of line. Many doctors were receptive to the idea of compulsory insurance because this would free them from lodge practice. And we had an episode where we talked about how the doctors, some doctors liked it, let them get their career started working with the fraternal order. But other doctors didn't like the way that there was accountability with fraternal orders. Sorry, okay. So the American Medical Association, the AMA, the AMA's Committee on Social Insurance predicted that it would finally end the commercial haggling of lodges and their practice of bidding down the struggling doctors to a minimum. You got to cry tears for these doctors that are being victimized, right? Yeah, let me read one more line. It depicted, the AMA's committee depicted compulsory insurance as a lifeline to rescue, quote, the unfortunate physician who, facing starvation, must accept this lodge practice. Anyway, I bet they weren't. But anyway, the average, and they said that the average income, they argued that the average income of physicians in Britain had increased since the introduction of compulsory insurance there. Okay. Now, what about the people opposing it? Before 1916, the main opponents to compulsory insurance were the commercial casualty and life companies, labor unions, and fraternal societies. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was emphatically opposed, and we'll come back to that. In 1907, for example, for the fraternal side here, the Fraternal Monitor condemned state-provided health, accident, and life insurance and predicted that it would sap that spirit of self-reliance so essential for continued progress and prosperity. We become a people of leaners instead of workers. I guess, yeah, leaner is someone who's leaning there and not getting anything done, I suppose, something like that. The Ladies' Review featured an editorial about a pension law recently enacted in Great Britain. According to the writer, most Americans regarded such plans as savoring too strongly of the paternal in government and putting a premium on improvidence. So remember, the name of this chapter is Substituting Paternalism that this would substitute paternalism for fraternalism, right? Fraternal hostility hardened and intensified after Great Britain took steps to enact compulsory old age insurance. No thoughtful person who has studied history, the Fraternal Monitor commented, and who realizes the governments are consumers, not creators of wealth, can watch the drift of things without a growing feeling of apprehension. Great Britain, had initially fought compulsory. The friendly societies in Great Britain had initially fought it, but later they assented to it. And one reason for this was that in the Act of 1911 that established this in Great Britain, it gave the societies official status as carrier organizations. So that is, they threw them a bone, right? And that got the fraternal societies on board. Let's see. Okay. A vocal fraternal supporter of compulsory insurance was former Congressman John J. Lentz, the founder and president of the American Insurance Union, and a member of the Board of Governors of Mooseheart. Remember, that was the organization that started that orphanage, which still exists to this day outside of Chicago and Illinois there, the Moosehearts. Lentz contended it was impossible to meet the awful problems of misery and poverty except by universal insurance. He charged that those who had cried the loudest against the paternalism or some other ism had always served the purpose of mud on the wheels of progress. As an alternative, he appealed to Giuseppe Mazzini's dictum, democracy is the progress of us all, through all, under the leadership of the wisest. Mazzini was a key person in the uniting of Italy into a nation state in the late 19th century. Okay. So there was a model law that they started being discussed. The Western Review emphasized the national insurance law in Great Britain had corrupted and weakened the societies in Britain by overwhelming them with red tape and malingers. That is, it took away their ability to be exclusive, right? And increased bureaucracy, or managerialism, as I put it in the title of the stream. The other side to this praise, I'm sorry, what is this? I need more context here. So the progressives, this is Commons, one of these progressives, right? He liked this. He said the fraternal societies, he liked that it would hurt the fraternal societies, I think. He said there was fear that the fraternal societies would upset the harmony and uniformity of a centralized plan. A committee of the Progressive Party rejected fraternal involvement and suggested that the British reliance on friendly societies as carrier organizations had set the stage for wasteful duplication and inefficiency. So at least some of the progressives just wanted the fraternal societies out of this altogether. They wanted it more, uniform and regularized and all that. Other comments in the Progressive Party's report revealed a deep distrust of voluntarism. These lodges, it proclaimed, have a further defect from a patriotic standpoint, in that they form centers of association for the different foreign nationalities, instead of creating, through a strong local sick fund, a nucleus for loyalty to the state. So that's interesting, right? This is a nationalism appeal. We don't want these people staying in their local ethnic organization, Italians being in a little Italian fraternal order. We want them to be tied to the state. I sort of understand where they're coming from, but I think it was a bad move. Okay, so now, battle in the states. So now it was time to try to get this compulsory insurance passed at the state level, right? Many doctors began to mobilize against compulsory insurance. The AALL found it increasingly difficult to exploit professional fears about lodge practice. By 1917, organized medicine had become more confident about its prospects, as its long campaign to limit the supply of new doctors was finally bearing fruit. According to some estimates, the income of physicians had risen as much as 41% from 1916 to 1919. I've already ranted about the evils of the AMA and how they have basically made medical care. They already, well before many other developments, they were already making medical care more and more expensive by just limiting the number of doctors. They control it at the level of certification and of medical schools. And that remains the case to this day. That's why you're often dealing with a nurse instead of a doctor these days. That's been my experience. World War I heightened the intensity of fraternal oppositions. For some fraternalists, the war and the post-war Red Scare were invitations to indulge in xenophobia. Now, I'm a little confused why he jumps from xenophobia to talking about socialists, but I guess for Americans, we would view socialism as a foreign import, which I'm all for that view. Alice B. Locke, a member of the Supreme Board of Trustees of the WBA, depicted compulsory health insurance as the brainchild of well-known radical socialists, chief among whom was Eugene Debs, now serving a well-merited sentence of imprisonment for sedition. I don't agree they should have imprisoned Debs for opposing World War I. But anyway, she described people who fought against compulsory insurance as 100% Americans. So there's some kind of patriotic call here, right? But now the war reinforced some suspicions that they had already, but they sort of strengthened them. Fraternalists took World War I as an object lesson in the eternal dangers of excessive government control. Most obviously, they drew a direct link between compulsory insurance and Prussian autocracy. So in 1918, John Sullivan of the NWA characterized the enactment of compulsory insurance under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck as the first installment in a plan to wrest autonomy from citizens by tying them and their family affairs directly to the imperial government. In the Fraternal Monitor in 1919, they had an editorial called The Menace of Social Insurance. It described how the wily Bismarck took the situation in hand and, while appeasing the socialists, foisted upon the people a system that made them mentally, morally, and industrially subservient to the Junkers. So I think what's happening here is you've got some pretty ferocious Teutonophobia, anti-German propaganda going on in World War I. I learned about this myself when I found out that the street I was living on, back when I was single, a street I was living on had actually originally had a German name and had been renamed during World War I. There's quite a lot of this sort of thing during World War I, then of course during World War II. And so the idea is you are opposed to mandatory social insurance. You point out that Bismarck had pushed this in Germany, and so you use the anti-German sentiment as a way to push your position, right? To not have mandatory insurance, compulsory health insurance. And then Minnie Adelet, Deputy Supreme Commander of the WA for the West Coast, described proposals for compulsory health insurance as part of a broader trend to force citizens to rely on government during wartime. Such behavior opened the door for political power to increase to levels which it was never intended any government should assume or undertake, even in time of war. R.H. Gerard, president of the NFCA in 1918, warned his listeners that democracy may become as despotic as king or czar, and there is danger that our people may fall into the heresies that led to tyranny after the French Revolution. By the way, if you ever read Rothbard's World War I as fulfillment of the intellectuals, I'm probably not saying it quite right, but basically that World War I was used as an excuse to put in a lot of schemes that had very little to do with the war in some cases, but it let them push some stuff that they just had not been able to successfully do outside of a war context. So all of this is kind of, they're onto something here, I think. To fraternal opponents, wartime events brought out in sharp relief the contrast between European practices of dependence and American principles of self-reliance. Adelot, again, declared that our men and women can and do stand on their own feet, Europeans, on the other hand, had become accustomed to letting their leaders do most of their thinking. Thus, she regarded compulsory health insurance as the product of a socialistic, paternalistic, and undemocratic movement. So anyway, giving you some flavor of the rhetoric going on here. Compulsory insurance, according to the critics, would corrupt America by introducing a new form of graft. And then they got a little bit of a gift here because several leaders of Tammany Hall endorsed the compulsory health insurance scheme. And just as we do now, Tammany Hall was associated with corrupt machine politics. So they jumped on this, and it says the Fraternal Monitor had a field day. The editors reasoned that Tammany politicians had not acted out of principle, but because they knew that the compulsory health insurance bill would provide over 50,000 jobs to the faithful. So it'd be a jobs program, right? Now, I really like this. The Fraternal Monitor went after this organization that had been pushing this all this time, the American Association for Labor Legislation, and they warned that this outfit was primarily was not a labor union. You know, its name made it sound like a labor union or something because it had the word labor in it. But it's primarily an organization of social reformers and college professors. It's funny to me. I mean, this is the sort of thing we'd say now, right? Here come the left-wing college people to push their stupid scheme, right? The Monitor clearly did not share the fascination with professional expertise that was so prevalent during the progressive era. Theorists in the classroom have produced few measures of practical progress. The application of their doctrines usually has led to oppression and bloodshed. Also, they feared that compulsory insurance was but a beginning, and that once they did that, then there'd be state-mandated fire insurance and all kinds of things, right? One persistent claim of the opposition was that compulsory insurance would strike a blow against individual independence and self-respect. Each person in this view discovers his powers generally through the necessity of being held to resolve his course himself. Landis cited the work of Herbert Spencer in rejecting compulsory insurance. Spencer had proved the impossibility of making people good through legislation. Instead, according to Landis, the best way to reach this goal was entirely by self-development. People have got to do things on their own and not just be told what to do, basically, right? Gender came into this on both sides. John Sullivan echoed the concerns of Samuel Gompers, an important labor leader, and others when he blamed compulsory insurance for causing the devitalization of manhood. And then on the other side, Bina West advised female lodge members that they had a special obligation to uphold for Americans the privilege we have always enjoyed of taking care of ourselves and helping one another. And Locke detected in compulsory health insurance a program that looks to the nationalization of women. Okay, now here we're talking about compulsory health insurance, but as I think is abundantly clear by now, on the welfare side at least, which I guess this is an aspect of that, right? The welfare state indeed seems to do a pretty good job of the devitalization of manhood, right? Rather than looking to the fathers, women more and more look to the state to be the ultimate provider. And you see a rise in divorce, a rise in single motherhood, a rise in, as I know from working in the inner city, men milling about rather than the community putting big pressure on them to, hey, support your family, right? You're the one to support them, so you're the primary support. Instead, the woman just gets welfare checks and the man becomes devitalized. So I think they were onto something with this, as we now know, 100 years later, right? The fraternalists also charged that compulsory insurance was unnecessary. Why adopt a new risky initiative when societies already gave Americans access to low-cost social insurance? In these organizations, any member secured the social element of the lodge room, fraternal assistance obtaining through distress of whatever nature, including unemployment and sickness, carrying its educating influences to the beneficence of protection. That is, we already have a system that's working, the fraternal, the mutual aid system. What is this legislation for? You're just trying some experiment. You want to try some experiment on a wide scale when we already have something that's working. Fraternalists questioned the record of compulsory insurance. Both Sullivan and the Fraternal Monitor cited statistics that the per capita frequency of sickness, as well as its duration, had increased markedly in Great Britain and Germany. They noted that both countries had higher death rates than the United States. Mises wrote about this. He said that if you pay for sickness, you will get more of it. I think that's I don't know where. I've read a lot of Mises. They found it especially difficult to explain, or proponents of compulsory insurance found it especially difficult to explain the divergence in death rates. That is interesting. Now, despite their celebration of mutual aid and declamations against paternalism, few fraternalists were willing to launch a full-scale attack on two other cornerstones of the American welfare state: mothers' pensions and workmen's compensation. So workmen's comp, we know about, there's an accident or whatever, you can't work. And so you, in part through your employer and part through the state, you get money, right? Mothers' pensions, I'd never heard of, also referred to as mother's aid or widow's aid, were cash payments distributed to impoverished single mothers in the US during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And I'm not going to go into detail on this, but basically these two things had already kind of been established while the fraternal societies were fighting the legal battle covered in the previous chapter. And so they just were not trying to fight that, because that ship had sailed. They were focusing their efforts on avoiding compulsory health insurance. Had compulsory health insurance become law, it would have covered a substantial portion of the working class. A key fraternal constituency. Workmen's compensation, by contrast, applied to the limited realm of workplace accidents, and mothers' pensions involved very few recipients. So they just weren't as focused on it. Now, something interesting here is, I'm going to skip that. He talks a little bit about how workmen's comp came out of some defects in the common law system, potentially. But anyway, interesting, but not going to try to do it all here. Okay, so by the end of 1917, fraternal opposition to compulsory insurance had come into its own. The societies had joined forces with their old enemies, the commercial insurers, to form umbrella organizations. So these guys are in conflict with each other, but none of them want the compulsory health insurance, right? Both fraternal and commercial insurers had long stressed the dangers of excessive government paternalism and the virtues of self-reliance. So they were together on this issue. So in 1914, the NCF commissioned a survey of compulsory insurance in Europe. Hey, we don't have to guess. We can see how it worked out over there, right? The final report was highly critical of what they saw. In the British system, utter inadequacy and comparative inefficiency of the medical treatment provided. This is before the NHS, right? Fraternalists often quoted the finding that compulsory insurance had led to a diminution of organized mutual aid in Britain. So the compulsory insurance displaced the mutual aid societies. Makes sense, right? And then they brought Frederick L. Hoffman on to look at this, chief statistician of the Prudential and a former president of the American Statistical Association. This is an interesting fellow. He had accumulated a long and often controversial record as a researcher on subjects, ranging from the pauper burial rate to tuberculosis in the dusty trades. He was perhaps best known as an exponent of white racial superiority. So they selected him as a member of their Committee on Social Insurance. The AALL, the ones who had been pushing this all along. They added him as a respected statistician or whatever. They put him on their Committee on Social Insurance, and they came to regret it because he did not like what he found. Hoffman increasingly depicted compulsory insurance as unduly paternalistic and destructive of self-help. In his letter of resignation, he worked on the committee for several years and then he retired, resigned. He said he rejected the contention that fraternal insurance cannot meet Americans' health needs, and he praised it as a commendable form of voluntary thrift. And then after he resigned, he continued to fight against compulsory insurance. Now, I should have looked this up, but Samuel Gompers, I want to make sure that I remember which organization. He was American Federation of Labor, the AFL, right? So under his leadership, the AFL had ended up being a real opponent of this and some other things. Gompers was kind of, I know this sounds surprising for a leader of a trade union, but he was kind of a libertarian or something. I've read a lot of great quotes from Gompers. He's very suspicious of the progressives and offering government as the solution to everything. He didn't buy it generally, So here's Gompers attacking the AALL. Here comes along a movement of men and women led by sophistry as to the cause of the ills and as to the hope for a better life, and willing to rivet the masses of labor to the juggernaut of government. Gompers, a lifelong Mason, had always been an exponent of voluntary methods to solve problems. At a convention of the National Casualty and Surety Agents, he stated that he did not carry insurance in any private company, but was insured in the union of my trade. I wish that there would be more of that insurance of a fraternal and mutual character. So remember, a lot of the fraternal organizations, sometimes it'd be organized along ethnic lines, whatever, but it was also just organized along lines of the job you were in. So you'd have your plumbers union or whatever, and you would arrange mutual aid through that. There were a lot of different ways it was done. So he's really coming from that mindset of, hey, this is a voluntary mutual organization. That's the way to do it, not through the state in particular. So now we turn to two state battles that really tell the story. California. So by 1917, there were signs that the tide was turning against compulsory insurance. The insurance federations, medical associations, and fraternal societies had stepped up the pressure. But the AALL decided to go for it anyway. They scheduled a public vote in November 1918, and they thought they would win it, and they lined up a lot of supporters, including endorsements from state and national figures such as Governor, later Senator Hiram Johnson, Governor William D. Stevens, Ray Lyman Wilbur, President of Stanford University, Daniel C. Murphy, President of the California State Federation of Labor, Theodore Roosevelt, might have heard of him, William G. McAdoo, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. But the opponents of compulsory insurance fought back hard. In January 19, opponents placed a full-page advertisement in the San Francisco Chronicle, charging that a compulsory plan would destroy the usefulness of many splendid fraternal benefit societies and vitiate fraternalism by replacing brotherly love with cold-blooded compulsion. Great record there. Replacing brotherly love with cold-blooded compulsion. I'm gonna have to remember that one to pull that out again. The final results in California were a stunning repudiation of compulsory insurance. The amendment crashed to defeat by a vote of 358,000 to 133,000. So I guess this was, sorry, my mind's gone blank. Referendum. It's like a referendum structure, right? It was not the representatives. It was the actual population voting on it. So they failed in California, but then they tried one more in New York. I won't go into great detail here, but Locke again, this is now 1920, depicted in compulsory insurance as class legislation of the most vicious type. It would compel the thrifty, moral, independent citizen to accept a thinly disguised form of poor relief, which he neither needs nor desires. And so the bill never even made it to a vote. It kind of got killed in committee. And this killed the movement for compulsory insurance in the United States. and dealt a major setback to the emerging welfare state in the United States. And we still don't have compulsory insurance. So that victory actually stuck. So wrapping this up, in 1934, a now chastened Isaac Rubinow reflected self-critically that it seems as if literally everyone had opposed compulsory insurance. And who was for it? An energetic, largely self-appointed group, which carried with it the profession of social work, to some extent the university teaching groups, the economic and social sciences, and even the political progressive organizations, but very little support beyond these narrow confines. And if you're sort of startled by economists being listed there, someone did a book that got a lot of attention about Robert T. Ely and the progressives and the economics about 100 years ago. Their big emphasis on eugenics and so forth. Anyway, it's all been well researched and well documented. The debate over compulsory health insurance had proven that fraternal opposition to governmental paternalism was alive and well. So, a fascinating story, I thought. Let's see here. I guess I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Can I show this? Oh, look at that. Wotan sent in $10 with like a super sticker thing or something. Sorry, I don't know what some of these things are. And I am not able to put it on the screen, but I didn't get a chance to thank Dawn Browning, who submitted some generous Australian donations with stickers over the last each of the last two episodes. So really appreciate the generous support. And let's see. Okay, yeah. Well, okay, I'll just highlight this real quick before I stop. Baltimore's Berserker brings up the Little House on the Prairie TV series, which I grew up watching. I thought it was great. And it touched on the way doctors used to get paid in random items or in IOUs back in the day. He says, I doubt they were starving, though. A new doctor moves into town and charges high rates and doesn't treat until he's paid in advance. The town begs the old doctor to practice medicine again. So that's interesting. So showing how medicine was really in flux back then, the mechanism for paying medicine. Okay, so I hope that was interesting. I think there's sort of, like I said, two aspects here. Understanding that history is valuable in and of itself, that there was this whole fight over compulsory health insurance and how it happened in much of the rest of Christendom, or whatever you want to call it, among other European countries, but it didn't in the United States. And so we got to hear a bit of that story. So that's quite interesting, because like I said, that has stuck. And as far as I know, you're not required to have health insurance. I think you can just refuse to have it. Even if you're working at a job that offers it, you do not have to accept it. I hope I'm not missing something, but that's my understanding. And then, yeah, I'm quite sure. I used to arrange my own health insurance when I was self-employed. I would, and nobody knew whether I had it or not. I never submitted to a government agency to tell them that I'd worked out this health insurance thing. So yeah, it's sort of up to us to figure it out in the United States. So that's helped the system to not be quite as horrible as the NHS and the system in Canada. They're not recommending death as treatment in the United States nearly as much as they do in Canada, for example. So that's good. And then, but the other angle here is that I'd really like to see mutual aid come back. We're working on that in a very practical and organized way with the Old Glory Club and the chapters of the Old Glory Club that we're starting to get officially formed. And part of our intention is to raise and contribute money such that we are able to help each other in times of, being canceled, say. Let us imagine. So if you're interested in that, then I recommend you look up the Old Glory Club. Yeah, do we have like a homepage? You know, it's funny. I'm not sure we have just like a website landing page. We do have a Substack. That's probably the best way to point people right now. So let me just share that with you. If that sounds of interest, if you're in the United States, the Old Glory Club. I did have, I'm not going to name him or anyone, but anything, but one of the fellows I met at an event that I spoke at in England last year contacted me, and he said he's quite interested in what the Old Glory Club was doing, would like to do something similar in England. So want to encourage people who wherever you are, be thinking about how we can bring mutual aid back to help us, because you know, the regime is not on our side, as I think everyone's figured out by now. So if we're going to have help, it's going to be from each other. And so it behooves us to learn lessons from the past. This is part of a series, which reminds me I need to add it to that playlist. In fact, I'll just do it right now. There's a mutual aid playlist on the my channel that has this whole series, if you're finding this interesting. As I said, the previous segments were focusing on how mutual aid worked, how they excluded people, and therefore were able to get rid of malingers and have a high trust situation, and we're able to form mutual aid organizations that functioned quite well. And they're not completely gone, as Clossington's presence here reminds me. Fraternal orders are still around. They were vitiated quite a bit, as we're going to find out as we continue through the series, but they're not completely gone. And I think we could look at bringing them back, because by now I hope everyone recognizes that the welfare state is not a great solution. And why would you want to be beholden, be dependent on a regime that hates you and probably wants to kill you, right? To be blunt, you know, we're deplorables to them, right? So we need to look to each other to help each other, I think, and learning how it was done in the past is in my view, a critical issue for us right now. So I hope you find this enjoyable and join us for the rest of the series. Next week will probably not be a new segment in this story. I alternate between right now this mutual aid series and doing a series with usually Black Horse as my co-host, where we talk about current economic affairs, financial markets, and economic prospects of Europe and things like that. So please join us next week for that, hopefully. Haven't checked with Black Horse since he's been gone on paternity leave, but hopefully we'll get them back. Yes, Carol Wolf says, God bless the deplorables. Amen. Please, Lord, have mercy on us. Okay, thanks everyone for joining the stream. Really appreciate it. Bye.